Hey, it's Ye for Yarn, and today I'm going to show you how to knit a super chunky shortcut brioche pom-pom hat. So the first thing you're going to need is the free written pattern. It's available on my blog. All you have to do is click the link in the description box and it will take you to the free written pattern. Or if you'd rather, you can also purchase a formatted large print PDF printable version ad-free on my Ravelry store. You'll also need the Lion brand Hometown USA yarn. This is Miami Sea Foam. If you want to substitute with a different yarn, this is a number 6 super bulky. You're also going to need a 32-inch circular knitting needle, and this is a size 11 or 8 millimeter. Now, one thing about this is that the smaller sizes in the pattern, that are the child sizes, are going to be too small even for a what's normally called a short circular knitting needle, which is about 16 inches long total. And those are also a little bit harder to come by in the thicker, chunkier sizes. So I'm going to be using a 32-inch circular with my size 11 interchangeable tips, and we're going to be doing magic loop method to knit our hat in the round without double pointed needles, and also not have to worry about having a short circular needle. You're also going to need a measuring tape or a ruler to measure your gauge, a pair of scissors, and a very large-eyed yarn needle. So all the information on sizing, measurements, gauge, and everything is in the free written pattern. It's also in the purchased PDF version of the pattern. So in this video, I'm just going to be demonstrating mainly the technique and how it's done. And so you will need to apply the numbers that apply to your size that you're knitting to the method that I'm demonstrating. All of the numbers, the stitch counts, and everything, and the dimensions will all be in the written pattern. So this hat is going to be knit in what I like to call shortcut brioche stitch, and it is not the typical method that you would use to make a brioche stitch. Here's a swatch, but it is a shortcut method that achieves the same look and finished fabric. And in fact, the structure of shortcut brioche stitch is pretty much identical to the brioche method of knitting. So this is super simple, super easy to do. If you can knit and purl, you can make this hat. So we are going to start with a long tail cast on. So I'm going to leave a good yard or more of a tail and make a slip knot. And I'm going to place the slip knot on my right needle. And then I'm just going to hold my yarn in what is normally called the slingshot position, where you have the yarn coming from the skein, going through your fingers and coming over your left index finger. And then the yarn from the tail runs over the back of your thumb and down into your other fingers that you're holding it with. So as usual for a long tail cast on, I'm just going to insert my right needle under the strand of yarn that is closest to me on the thumb, on the front of my thumb. I'm going to pick that up. I'm going to come over here and scoop up the yarn that's coming over the top of my index finger and pull it through that strand of yarn, or under it anyway. And then I'm going to let go of it with my thumb and pull it tighter with my thumb. You don't want it to be real tight because we do want this to have some stretch in it, but we just want to get a bunch of that extra slack out of there. So again, I'm inserting my right needle under the strand of yarn that is in front of my thumb. I'm coming around and picking up the strand that's coming off of my index finger and pulling it underneath. Then removing my thumb and taking most of the slack out of that stitch. So we're just going to keep doing this to create our cast on edge. So for the size that I'm making, the adult small, I'm going to be casting on 38 stitches. So here's 5. So there is my 38. You always want to double check and count again just to make sure. And that is the correct number of stitches. So we're going to leave the tail out of the way. And basically what we're going to do, it doesn't matter where, but we're going to split this set of stitches kind of in half, because we can't start knitting in the round if the tip of our needle is not able to, be on these first stitches of our cast on. And this will not stretch far enough to reach the tip of the needle. So we're going to use something that's commonly called the magic loop method, where we're going to take this flexible cable on our circular needle. I'm just going to grab a stitch here in between and just pull out a section of that cable and slide the left needle tip down into the beginning of our cast on edge, and that will help us, kind of be able to knit in the round as we normally would, and we still have that extra slack in our cable needle over here in this looped area. So first we're going to start by joining to work in the round, and that basically means that we want to make sure our cast on is straight, it's not twisted, it's not wrapped around itself. We want to make sure that the edge, the cast on edge, runs all the way along the inside here, and we're going to bring the needle tips together. You want to make sure you're working with the yarn that's coming from the skein, and we are going to begin knitting round 1. So to do this, we're going to knit the first stitch and purl the second stitch. So we're basically doing a knit 1, purl 1 rib for this row. So knit 1 and purl 1 and knit 1 and purl 1, basically until we get to the split part in our magic loop where all the slack of our cable needle is looped around out of the way. And this, I think, is a lot easier than working with double pointed needles if you are a beginner. Double pointed needles are not as intimidating as they look, but especially for a beginner, I think that the magic loop method is a little more convenient. So now that I've knit all the way off of the first section that we had looped, like this, I've knit all the stitches that were on that side, and I'm going to go back here to where my beginning of the round was, and I'm just going to pull the slack out of the other side of the needle, slide those next stitches onto that tip, and then pull the other half of our needle, or the other end, the other tip, out of the way, and I'm going to kind of loop it around like this so that it's not, straight and then having to, be all twisted up. So I'm going to loop it around like this and then continue around. All right, so now we've knit all of the stitches off of the second part of the needle. We're just going to, again, slide that slack into our magic loop. And this is the end of the round, the beginning / end point of our round. So what we want to do here is we want to place a stitch marker. We could have also done this at when we finish the cast on, but we can do it right now as well. You can either use the tail, the yarn tail, to help you remember where the beginning and end of the round is, or we can put a stitch marker on our work. Now with the magic loop method, I am not as fond of using the kind of stitch marker that you slip, especially when your needles are this big, because a lot of the kind that I have that you can slip are not big enough for this needle size. So even this one does not fit onto the needle. So I have a locking stitch marker here, or you can use a safety pin, a bobby pin, whatever you happen to have. This is basically a plastic safety pin that does not have a point on it. So I'm just going to insert this into the first stitch of my round. So now we're going to start working on the brioche part, or the shortcut brioche part. I'm again going to pull on my right needle tip and get some slack in my magic loop. And we're going to start with our shortcut brioche stitch in the round. Now, shortcut brioche stitch is, like I said, a different method. It's not real, the real brioche method of creating this type of fabric, but it is a kind of a cheater method to get the same look, stretch, feel, and fabric structure. And we achieve this with a stitch called knit one below or purl one below. And that basically means that instead of inserting the needle into the stitch that's on the left needle, we're going to insert it into this stitch down here, this stitch below from the previous row. So for our second round, we're going to be doing a sequence of knit one below, purl one, knit one below, purl one, knit one below, purl one, all the way around. And so I'm going to, instead of knitting into this stitch normally, by inserting my right needle into the actual stitch, I'm going to come down here and insert it into the stitch below. I'm going to knit it as normal, and then after I knit through it, let it fall off of the left-hand needle. So that was my knit one below. I'm going to purl one normally. Then I'm going to work a knit one below into this stitch. So again, instead of inserting into the stitch that is on my needle next, I'm going to insert into the stitch from the row below and knit through that, and then let it come off of my left needle. Then here's my purl, knit one below, purl one, and the knit one below is actually very, very simple to work. We're just inserting the needle in a different place. It's just the same as a regular knit stitch. We're just inserting the needle down here instead of up here. So again, I'm going to knit one below and purl one all the way around. And I have knit all of the stitches off the first part of my magic loop needle. So again, I'm going to slide that slack into the loop part of the magic loop and get it out of the way so that my left needle can slide down into those stitches, and then take that extra slack and loop it around my hand with my right needle, and then just continue around, knitting one below and purling one. Alright, so now I'm back to the beginning of my round. And because my stitch marker is in the first stitch of the cast on, or the first row, the fabric of the knitting instead of on my needle, I don't have to worry about moving it up every row, as long as I just pay attention to where this stitch column lines up, so that I always know that the stitch column with the marker at the bottom is the first stitch of the round. So now we're going to knit our third round, which is very similar to the second one. We're going to knit the first stitch normally, and then we're going to work a purl one below, which is the same as a regular purl stitch, but again, we're working into the stitch from the row below. So I have my yarn to the front just as a normal purl, and instead of inserting my needle as if to purl into the next stitch, I'm going to insert it as if to purl into the stitch below, like so. So for this round, we're going to knit one normally and then purl one below, knit one, purl one below, knit one, purl one below, all the way around till we get back to the beginning of our round. Alright, so I am back to the beginning of my round. I'm going to move the slack of my left needle into the magic loop and bring it back into my right needle. So this is what we have so far, and I just pulled the slack out of my loop, but that's okay. So the brioche fabric is super duper stretchy, but we won't be able to see a whole lot of its structure until we get a few more rows into it. So I'm going to knit a few more rows, and then I'm going to show you why this shortcut method works and the kind of structure that it creates in this fabric. Alright, so I have knit a few more rows. Basically, we're just repeating rows 2 and 3 until our piece is the correct length for the size that we're making. And again, all that information is in the pattern. But I just wanted to stop and show you the structure of this fabric. Brioche or shortcut brioche fabric is incredibly stretchy, airy, and squishy, and it has this beautiful texture. And this is achieved normally in regular brioche with the brioche method. That is achieved by having yarn overs and then purling yarn overs together with some of the stitches and slipping stitches, and it's definitely more complicated than this method. So basically what happens with this method is when we work below into a stitch and then drop the stitch above it off of our left needle. That stitch above it unravels and kind of pops down into the fabric and creates this strand of yarn that runs across the back of the stitch. And that is what creates the amazing stretch and airiness that this stitch has. So if you happen to lay this project down and come back to it later and you don't know which row you stopped on, you don't know if the last row you did was row 2 or row 3, so you're not sure which row to knit next, you can check which row you're on by a simple trick that you can kind of read the fabric. So when we knit, we always have the yarn coming from the last knit stitch, or the stitch that was knitted last or purled or whatever we did to it. The last worked stitch on the right hand needle is where we stopped. So the yarn will always be coming from the last stitch on the right hand needle. And the left hand needle will be the next part that we're about to knit. So that's how you know you have the right side facing you. If you had the wrong side facing you, although both sides are identical, if you were to start knitting like this, then you would be going back and forth instead of in the round. So if I have this side facing me, the yarn is coming from the first stitch on the left needle, and that is not correct. The yarn should always come from the last stitch on the right needle. So that's how we know we have the correct side facing. So to tell which row you did last, the stitch that you knit below into is going to be the one with the strand of yarn running across the back. So look at this column of purls, for example. This is not a normal purl stitch. It has a double strand of yarn, not just the strand that makes it a stitch, but also there's a second strand that runs across the back. So that's how we know that the last row I did was the row with the purl one below, which is our row 3. But let's pretend that the last one we knit was our knit one below row. Then it would look like this, where that all of the knit stitches have that strand of yarn running across the back, and the purl stitches only have a single strand. So because the fabric is identical on both sides, except for, which columns have the strands running across the back, the right side that has the purl columns with the double strand on the back, those same columns appear as knit stitches on the wrong side. So that's why it's so important to make sure that you're looking at the fabric from the right side to check which row that you are working next. So I'm going to continue repeating rows 2 and 3 until my piece is the correct length. Alright, so I have knit to the length that the pattern has specified for the size I'm making. And now what we need to do is cinch the top of the hat closed. But because this is so bulky and there are so many stitches, it's going to be hard to cinch it if we cinch all of these stitches together in one step. So what we're going to do is kind of do it in 2 steps so that we'll make it less bulky at the top and make it close more. And by the way, when you are repeating your rows 2 and 3 and you stop at the length that you need, it doesn't matter which row you end on as long as it's the correct length. So I have my giant yarn needle here, and I have cut the yarn, leaving not quite a yard, but almost a yard of a tail. Now, right here in my skein, I have a knot that was in the yarn already, and I'm not going to stop, take this apart, attach a new yarn, weave in 2 extra ends. I'm just going to, because this is a pretty secure joint right here, I'm just going to kind of bury it in the cinching, and then we will have it out of the way. It will hide underneath the pom-pom. It will be invisible, and it will still be secure. So I'm going to take the end of my tail and thread it into the eye of my giant yarn needle. And basically what we're going to do to cinch this closed is we are going to cinch all of the purl stitches together and all of the knit stitches together. So to do this, my needles are probably going to bang around on the table for a little bit. but we are going to slip every other stitch. And when we slip a stitch, that just means we pass it from the left needle to the right needle without doing anything to it. So I'm going to slip all the knit stitches and cinch the purl stitches together, and then I will cinch the knit stitches together separately. So this first stitch is a knit stitch, so I'm going to just slip it onto my right needle and bring it forward, and then you want to make sure that when you take your next stitch with the yarn needle that the knitting needle is out of the way, and then I'm just going to insert my yarn needle into the purl stitch and pull it through. So now the next stitch is a knit stitch. I'm going to make sure that my cinching yarn is out of the way. I'm going to pick up the next knit stitch and slip it to the right needle, hold it to the front, and then I'm going to take my yarn needle and pick up the purl stitch and pull it through. So again, I'm going to slip the knit stitch to the right needle and hold it to the front, and then pick up the purl stitch and pull the cinching yarn through. So I'm going to keep doing this all the way around until I've run out of stitches. I will have all the knit stitches onto my needle, and all of the purl stitches will be on my cinching yarn. Alright, so here's the last purl, and now all of my knit stitches are on the needle, all of my purl stitches are on the cinching yarn. So I'm just going to pull on that cinching yarn until I close up that hole as much as is possible, because this is still a bulky yarn. Then I'm going to pick up a strand of yarn from that cinched area, wrap the yarn around my needle, just making sure I'm keeping it pulled tight. And now that that is secured, I can now go ahead and cinch all of the knit stitches. So I'm going to just hold my seaming yarn out of the way for a moment and pull my knitting needle back into the stitches, the left needle. And what I'm going to do here, because the area is already cinched closed on the purl side, and we're going to cinch it closed on the knit side, there isn't really a whole lot of room to have this knitting needle fit through. So I'm going to kind of magic loop that again and pull the tip of the left tip of the knitting needle through and leave a loop here in the cable. So now I can just go ahead and pick up all of the knit stitches off of the needle all the way around with my yarn needle. So now I can just slide my left needle into the rest of these stitches. It's going to be a little snug because the needle is straight and the stitches are now no longer, flexible because those purls are cinched, but it still works. And so now we can just pull that yarn tight and it will cinch the top of our hat closed. Now I kind of lucked out here because the knot, I still have enough left in my yarn before the knot that I can just cut it off right there at that knot and then thread it into my yarn needle and just use this remaining section to tie it off and bury the tail. So I'm just going to pull this as tightly closed as I can get it, just as we did before, and I'm going to pick up a strand from the other side of the cinch where we started, and again wrap the yarn around the needle and try to make it as tight of a knot as possible, or tight of a cinch. And there we go. Now that is cinched closed. And now I can just bury this yarn tail into that cinched area of the fabric. So I'm just going to kind of thread it through the already cinched stitches and go around a couple times, just because that is one of the easiest ways to bury a tail in brioche, especially when it is this chunky. So now I can just trim off the little extra bit at the end. Now all we have left is to attach our pom-pom and weave in our starting tail. Now I had already made the pom-pom from the other end of my skein, so this is already made. I used my Clover Pom Pom Maker. If you want to see how I did that, you can go watch my demonstration of how to use the Clover Pom Pom Maker. So what I like to do is kind of shake the pom-pom out and fluff it up a little bit, and then just trim any little scraggly pieces that appear to be sticking out. So when we make the pom-pom, we end up with two yarn tails. I have one long one and one short one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim the short one the same length as the rest of the pom-pom so that that end will just blend in. Get that out of the way, and then we'll take the long one and use it to attach the pom-pom to our hat. So what we're going to be stitching into is the top of the hat and this strand of yarn that runs around the center of the pom-pom to hold it together. That's going to be our attachment point, so to speak. So I'm going to bring the yarn needle down into the cinched part of my hat, pull it relatively tight, then I'm going to kind of reach under here and get that strand of yarn that is underneath there. And then I can come over here and pick up another strand from the hat, and then come back again and grab that center strand of the pom-pom again. And again, just grab a couple strands from the top of the hat. And then on this side, of course, we come around and get that pom-pom strand. So when the pom-pom is secure, we're just going to pull it tight, and we're going to kind of reach under here again and make a knot to secure it. Like so. And I'm just going to bring my yarn needle through that center pom-pom strand, like so, so that the knot is kind of hidden underneath our pom-pom. And then again, I'm just going to trim that tail till it's the same length as the other strands in the pom-pom, and the end of it will just disappear. We won't have to weave it in because it's already secured with several knots. So now our pom-pom is on the hat. All we have left to do is deal with this starting tail. So what we're going to do is remove the stitch marker. And of course we need to thread our starting tail onto the yarn needle. And as you can see right here, there's kind of a little split in our cast on because this first knit stitch starts with a slip knot. So what I'm going to do is take the yarn tail that I have on my needle and bring my needle down into the knot part of that slip knot right there and just pull it through, and that will help close up the gap in our cast on. So now we can just turn this over a little bit and make a knot. So now that is secure, and we can just weave in this tail. So the brioche fabric is a little bit harder to weave into and still keep that tail invisible, especially when it's this bulky. So we're going to weave it into this first row that was our knit one, purl one row that did not have any knit one below or purl one below stitches in it. So we're just going to kind of follow this cast on around and follow the strands of the knit and purl stitches from our cast on or from our first row. So you just want to stop while you're doing this part and periodically give that edge a stretch to make sure that you're not limiting the stretch of the cast on edge as you weave this in. So for this very last little bit of the tail, My tail is already woven into the cast on pretty far. All I've got left is just a little tiny bit left of this tail. So what we're going to do is kind of bury this in this channel in between the knit and purl stitches, and then it will kind of be more hidden than if I were to just cut it, because if I just cut it, it's going to end up wiggling its way out. So as you can see, these diagonal strands that run from the knit column to the purl column, I'm just going to kind of insert underneath those and pull it through. And there are matching diagonal strands running the opposite angle on the other side. So it kind of creates a little tunnel or channel for that tail to hide in. Now I decided that at the end of my little yarn tail that I would split the strands of the yarn and tie them together in a knot over another strand from the inside, and then I just buried those little kind of half thickness yarn tails into the strands that were already in the finished fabric, and that secures my tail and makes sure that it does not wiggle its way out. So there is our finished hat. We have a nice stretchy edge. The entire thing is super stretchy and springy, and we have this nice fluffy little pom-pom on the top to finish it off. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you make this project, let me know how it turns out for you in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, making sure you click the little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified of new videos. Thanks for watching.